Come winter 1891, the freight route east of the Bitterroots had turned into a snow-covered burial ground. So many men had perished there that they no longer kept count. A 8-year-old freighter named Pierce Halbrook had no false hopes about that harsh truth, guiding his battered wagon across the exposed mountain crest. It had been 5 days since he'd left the derelict silver camp at Garnet Basin. Behind him remained the frozen grave of his wife, whose life he had sold everything to save, yet still lost. Everything he owned now was an old horse called Brim, a torn oil tarp, and a ramshackle wagon that was close to falling into pieces. His goal, his relative's ranch in the valley to the south, remained 50 miles away, but whatever chance he had of survival ended the moment the north sky began to change. It wasn't that the sky darkened, it became flat, pressing against the earth like a cold slab of iron. Brim stopped before Pierce even touched the reins, and that was the first clue. Not clouds, not snow, but the horse. The aged animal planted his hooves into the frozen grass, swung his head to the north, and pinned his ears forward before flattening them. The stillness was the next thing Pierce noticed. The wind didn't die down. It simply disappeared, as if the entire ridge had gulped air and then frozen. Because he'd spent enough years in the high country, Pierce knew what that absolute calm in winter meant. It wasn't a reprieve. It was a sign that the world was shifting its attention somewhere else. Rising onto the wagon seat, Pierce looked northward. The storm front reached the full length of the horizon, black at its top and gray along its base. Beneath it, snow was already streaking sideways over the ground. He had under 2 hours, maybe 1. With no cabin close by, he didn't push Brim faster. He got down, put a gloved hand on the animal's neck, and stayed quiet until Brim settled. Pierce examined the area next: the hillside, the ridge crest, the old snowbanks, and the dark basalt rocks to the southwest. He wasn't hunting for a house, a forest, or a fire. He was hunting for walls. After a long moment, he steered Brim away from the freight road and headed toward the Black Bluffs. The first notch faced too far north. Once the blizzard arrived, wind would slam straight into it. The second opening lay deeper, but its mouth was far too broad. There was too much open space, with plenty of roots for moving air to enter. Pierce moved on until the third recess brought him to a halt. Tucked low in the basalt wall, its entrance was about 15 feet wide, and thick black rock walls curved inward under a shallow lip. Within, the rock floor was dry, free of drifted snow, and free of cracked roof slabs that might break away in the cold. The most important thing was that the opening angled slightly away from the northwest wind coming over the ridge. This was not a cave, just a scar in the stone. But Pierce looked at it and saw something far better: 3 walls already there. For the first time since the sky had changed, he felt a faint shift in his chest. Not hope, not confidence, only the stern realization that if he could make a 4th wall, he still had a real chance to live. Years before that storm, before Garnet Basin, before Clara's illness ate away his savings bill by bill, Pierce had worked on mountain freight bridges. Amos Varn, a repair foreman, had been his boss. One winter night close to Elk Creek Pass, Amos had the entire crew stand underneath a bridge deck. The deck was patched together with canvas and warped pine planks, with snow blowing through the canyon overhead. The old foreman lit a lantern and raised it to a thin gap between the boards. The flame barely shifted, but the smoke curled away. A wisp of gray air filtered through the gap and faded into the blackness. Amos watched it for a heartbeat and then said, "It ain't the cold that kills a man. Moving air does. A room never freezes all at once. It bleeds away its warmth degree by degree." That harsh lesson stayed with him now. The wind didn't have to tear a shelter apart. One opening, one seam, one crack, just a single spot was enough. Through it, moving air could slip in and drain heat faster than the body could refill it. Pierce glanced again at the hollow beneath the basalt ledge. Then he turned toward the wagon isolated on the ridge. Its left axle had been cracked since Deer Lodge crossing. The sideboards were bowed. A wheel was crooked on its hub, and the edge of the oil tarp hung ripped and loose. A trader over in Garnet Basin had looked at the whole outfit and called it a pile of boards about to fall apart. Pierce saw no boards. He saw the 4th wall. And there, Beneath the pressing sky, he saw something else with the same certainty. Before the storm ended, he would have to pull apart the last thing that still tied him to the life he'd led before Clara passed away. Pierce climbed back to the ridge as the northern sky shut over the valley. The storm wall had eaten most of the daylight, leaving only the dull gray hue of steel left in ashes too long. He went right to work. The front axle first, then the rear pins, then the tongue brace that was frozen hard to the frame. The iron resisted every attempt. A single cotter pin wouldn't move at all. Pierce spent nearly 3 minutes hammering it with deadened fingers. The chill cut deeper through his gloves and into the bones of his right hand. The first puffs returned, not the full wind yet, only quick blasts of cold sweeping along the ridge, like the breathing of an immense animal. It was still building power before the charge. At last the brace snapped loose. The wagon frame dropped flat into the snow with a deep crack that called to mind the timbers of an old house. The wagon was splitting under the excessive load of winter. Pierce tied the rawhide rope across his shoulders and began dragging. The wagon bed scraped over the frozen earth, inch by inch. Its shattered edge kept gnawing into the crusted snow and the stones hidden beneath the drifts. More than once, the whole mass twisted sideways, nearly yanking Pierce off his feet. At first, Brim tried to haul beside him, but a distant roll of thunder snow jerked the old horse backward against the traces. In a panic, Pierce cut the animal free before it could overturn the entire frame, and afterward, he pulled the weight alone. The rope gnawed through his coat and stripped the skin underneath. Each cough into the bitter air filled the back of his throat with blood. Behind him, the storm kept spreading across the north until it felt less like weather and more like a second night rising above the peaks. By the time the wagon finally slid into the shadow of the basalt overhang, Pierce was on the verge of collapsing next to it. The hollow was scarce wide enough. Pierce pulled the wagon bed to the mouth of the basalt opening until it covered the deepest point beneath the overhang. The bowed sideboards now turned outward, like the side of a river barge stuck in the snow. Still, it wasn't enough the wagon only covered the center, but narrow openings remained on both sides, letting the wind slice straight through the shelter. Once the storm hit full strength, Pierce ignored the ache in his shoulders and dragged the torn oil tarp over the upper gap. He used the hammer butt to force wagon pegs through the frozen leather straps. Then he set heavy basalt stones along the edge of the tarp under the rock ledge to pin it down. The first real gust arrived before he finished, and the tarp burst outward with a crack like a rifle report. The whole shelter trembled. One leather strap tore loose from its peg and flailed hard against the wood. Pierce lunged up and scrambled onto the wagon frame as the wind strengthened. His right hand was almost dead, and he could scarcely feel the rope as he retied the knot. Beneath him, the hollow moaned with moving air. For an instant, he stood balanced above the black gap as the storm bore down on the ridge. Pierce knew exactly what would happen if the next knot let go. The shelter would cease to be a wall and become a funnel. Then the seams had to be dealt with. On his knees, Pierce moved along the shelter, working by touch as much as by sight. Outside, the light had shifted to that strange iron-gray color that arrived just before the harshest winter storms. The wind leaned and hissed against the wagon boards, while loose snow rushed across the ridge over the hollow. To start, he packed the openings with dry sagebrush, then followed that with strips of buffalo hide cut from a worn-out harness blanket. Afterward, he packed frozen mud scraped from the base of the basalt wall tightly into the lower crevices where the wagon frame touched the ground. Every joint and fissure counted. The storm didn't need the entire shelter, opened up just one location where moving air could slip in and continue its flow. A thin draft suddenly cut across the side of Pierce's neck from underneath the wagon bed, and the bite of cold was like a knife wound. He froze on the spot and swung around toward it. A crack no wider than 2 fingers. Where the rough ground dipped below the buckled wood, that tiny gap was all it took. Wind pushed through in a fine, invisible current, so cold it could drain warmth directly through wool and flesh. Pierce went onto both knees and dug the gritty frozen soil away with his naked fingers. The dirt skinned his fingertips almost right away, yet he kept scraping. He shoved mud and snow into the opening, exactly how a mason packs mortar into masonry joints before the next deep freeze. Even more dirt, more crusted snow, and more sagebrush. He flattened the mixture against the wagon's rim until the draft stopped completely. Then he halted and took in the hollow around him. Every trace of daylight was gone. No breath of moving air touched his face. For the first time since abandoning the freight trail, the space enclosed by those basalt walls felt isolated from the storm massing outside. Though it never grew warm, it never would be warm. And as he knelt there by the sealed seams, with mud turning to ice against his raw and bleeding hands, Pierce came to a realization. The blizzard had not yet realized he was no longer trying to construct any kind of shelter. His goal was to form a pocket of still air that the wind could never reach. Pierce made himself keep Brim outside right up until the final moment, and not because he felt indifferent or cold-hearted. It was a brutal imperative of survival. The old horse carried heat within its body, warmth, moisture, breath, and bulk that could fill an airtight space. All of that held value, for the storm had drawn so near that the ridge just above the hollow had begun to wail. Pierce snatched the dangling reins and steered Brim toward the little opening left beside the wagon bed. The horse held back instantly. Its nostrils flared, warm exhalations met the freezing air, and thick white plumes materialized. Another surge of wind struck the basalt ridge overhead, and Brim lost his nerve. The horse crashed side first into the wagon frame with a jolt that rocked the whole shelter. Timber groaned, and a leather strap let go with a sharp crack that made Pierce's gut clench. He flung both arms around the animal's head at once, stopping it from colliding with the frame again. For a few drawn-out seconds, the hollow was pure pandemonium. Outside, the wind screamed. Above, the canvas snapped. The wagon shook against the basalt walls, and Brim thrashed blindly against the close, dark space. Then Pierce rested his forehead on the horse's neck and stayed fixed there while the shaking ran its course. "Easy now," he whispered. The words slipped out before he understood where they were coming from. Clara had spoken exactly that phrase every winter morning as she brushed frost from Brim's mane by the old stable fence outside Garnet Basin. Easy now. The recollection moved through him and vanished just as swiftly as it had arisen. Gradually, the horse gave up its struggle. Its breathing slowed, and the tension underneath Pierce's hands loosened. Only at that point did he walk Brim fully into the hollow. Next, he closed off the final opening, a saddle blanket over the bottom gap, with sagebrush tucked into the corners. Frozen snow was pressed solidly into every seam until the outline blended into white. When he finally stepped back inside the dark, cramped space beneath the basalt ledge, the shelter felt complete for the first time. It wasn't robust, it wasn't cozy, but it was sealed. Within that enclosed pocket of unmoving air, the slow sound of Brim's breathing gradually filled the blackness. It seemed like the last faint trace of life remaining on the ridge. Darkness closed around the hollow much sooner than Pierce expected. This was not ordinary darkness, it was a sealed-in darkness, the kind that appears when snow, canvas, stone, and timber close over the world from every side all at once. Inside the confined space, the smells grew heavier. Frigid basalt, horse sweat, damp leather, and frozen mud stuffed into the cracks by torn hands. Brim stirred once behind him, then became quiet again. A slow stream of warm breath moved through the hollow and dissolved into the black. Pierce let himself settle against the rocky wall beneath the overhang for the first time since he had spotted the storm on the northern horizon. He couldn't make out even the smallest patch of sky anymore. There was no loose knot left to pull tight, no seam left to plug, no board left to adjust into place. The shelter was now finished, and that meant the storm outside took over the remaining work. The first heavy surge of wind moved over the ridge like muffled thunder traveling far below the surface. Pierce shut his eyes for a brief moment. He wasn't driven by fear, nor was he praying. He was simply exhausted, because under the weight of the approaching blizzard, he recognized something he hadn't felt in months. Following Clara's death, every day became another effort to keep together a life that was already falling apart. But here, beneath the basalt ridge, with the fourth wall shut tight against the mountain wind, there was just one thing left to protect himself, until morning. The blizzard didn't arrive slowly. It slammed into the ridge. At first, there was only pressure mounting beyond the basalt walls. Then, in an instant, the whole mountain seemed to absorb one violent impact. That force rolled through the stone under Pierce's back like rail cars colliding. He never actually saw the storm. Inside the hollow's sealed darkness, he heard it rather than saw it. A long, booming howl swept over the ridge and struck the shelter hard. It was powerful enough to knock dust loose from the basalt ceiling. The tarp flapped wildly above him, while the wind beat against the wagon boards in heavy, almost living surges. Snow powder wormed through the smallest seams in slim white streams, curling through the dark like smoke from invisible fires. The strain on the shelter became a physical presence, not just cold, but weight. It shoved against the fourth wall with so much power that Pierce felt the wagon frame tremble under his boots. Brim twitched once behind him and stomped hard on the stone floor. Outside, the storm shrieked across the mountain. Inside, the hollow moaned from the pressure, but the wagon bed didn't shift. The basalt walls held their ground, and the tarp stayed anchored beneath the overhang. Slowly, as he listened to the wind probe every seam and corner, Pierce grasped something about blizzards that most people got wrong. The storm wasn't trying to break the walls apart. It was searching for an entrance. At the same time, the temperature in the hollow just kept dropping. Pierce felt the cold descending deeper into the basalt floor and pushing through his boots, his coat, his stiff hands. Frost collected on the wagon boards, while Brim's breath hung in the blackness as slow white clouds. But the character of the air had shifted. The furious swirling had stopped. That was the only thing that mattered. Pierce had watched freight hands freeze on mountain trails before. Most people assume the cold alone kills. That's false. Men died when wind pulled heat out of their bodies, faster than blood and muscle could replenish it. The real robber wasn't winter, but moving air. The blizzard still howled somewhere beyond the shelter's buried chinks, but it no longer rushed through the hollow, looking for skin and breath to carry off. The packed cracks held fast under the combined weight of snow and stone. Their small pocket of still air remained calm. Slowly, sitting next to the warmth coming off Brim, Pierce recognized that Amos Varn had been right all those years ago beneath the freight bridge. A shelter didn't survive because it stayed warm. It survived because the wind couldn't move through it anymore. The longest portion of the night began after the first strike passed. That wasn't because the storm grew weaker, but because it kept changing. A screaming gust raced across the ridge, tearing out one of the upper seams above the tarp with a crack like snapping leather. Freezing air poured in through the gap at once. Pierce climbed onto the wagon frame in absolute blackness, feeling for the loose strap with fingers already too stiff to bend well. The knot slipped away twice before he yanked it tight. Beneath him, Brim panicked as another enormous gust rumbled over the mountain, kicking hard against the wagon bed. The entire shelter gave a violent lurch, and a ribbon of snow dust flashed across the floor. That narrow white stream of ice was so cold it could burn exposed skin. Pierce dropped back down, tracking the draft through the dark entirely by touch. He pinpointed the leak near the bottom edge of the frame and packed snow into it first. Then he stuffed in frozen mud and pieces of old buffalo hide, packing them deep into the crack like oakum wedged between ship planks. Outside, the blizzard kept pounding the ridge, but gradually something odd started to occur. Instead of cutting through the seams, the wind hitting the rock face was accidentally pressing ice and powdery snow into the openings layer by layer. The cracks were effectively sealing themselves. At one point, the hollow shook so fiercely that Pierce wrapped both arms around Brim's head, pulling the trembling horse against his chest while the wind screamed savagely. Then the awful moment passed. The space beneath the rock went still, leaving only the steady beat of their breathing. Hours slid by beneath the basalt overhang. Pierce could only gauge time by sound now. Little by little, the storm began to alter. The endless howl outside had grown dull at the edges, and the wind battering the shelter lessened. The tarp overhead snapped far less violently. The enormous drifts piling up outside had grown so high they swallowed nearly the whole face of the wagon bed. What ought to have buried Pierce had become his shield. The crushing weight of the packed snow formed a powerful barrier, entirely cutting off the freezing drafts. The storm had essentially wrapped the space in an insulating cocoon. The blizzard sounds grew odd and remote, deadened beneath the heavy snow. The hollow no longer seemed exposed on the mountainside. Instead, it felt deeply embedded in the earth. And in that pitch-black stillness, near the even warmth of Brim's breathing, Pierce finally understood the true nature of the shelter he had created. He hadn't defeated the storm. He'd simply rearranged his surroundings, letting the storm slide past him instead of cutting through him. Pierce couldn't say how long he slept. Inside the snow-buried hollow, hours ceased to matter. Only breath, cold, and silence marked time. He woke gradually to Brim, stirring in the blackness nearby, and to the storm's end, though not utter silence. The mountains gave occasional creaks under the snow's weight. A faint breeze still stirred far above the ridge, but the immense roaring fury was gone. It felt like the world after some colossal thing had already swept through. Pierce rose carefully and reached into the dark. His fingers met wagonwood first. Then came the tarp, frozen as stiff as sheet metal, and behind him the basalt wall. Everything was cold and unyielding, yet it all held. Through Brim's thick winter coat, his side gave off gentle warmth. Soft white frost from his nostrils melted into the blackness. Pierce drew a jerky strip from his coat and chewed slowly. The meat was nearly as hard as oak bark. He chased it with water kept inside his coat all night to avoid freezing solid. Then he stayed still and listened once more. No howling, no slamming wind, and in the exhausted silence beneath the mountain, nothing probing the cracks any longer. Pierce realized this marked the first night since Clara's death that he'd slept without dreaming. There were no dreams of coal smoke, medicine bottles, or winter coughing through thin walls. A thin, pale line of light finally emerged along the frozen edge of the tarp. Pierce stared at it for a few seconds before he truly understood what it meant. The blizzard was over, and he forced himself upright, muscles aching from cold and fatigue. Then he dug at the packed drift, sealing the shelter. First with bare hands, then with the broken handle of his shovel. Hard white chunks of snow caved in. Cold air rushed through, but it came with no violence. When Pierce finally crawled out beneath the basalt overhang, the world seemed erased. The freight trace had vanished. Sagebrush flats were buried under smooth white drifts. Even the ridgelines looked softened into pale curves beneath the snow. Nothing moved. A moment later, Brim climbed out behind him. The old horse halted next to the buried shelter and breathed into the frozen morning. The white vapor drifting from the animal's nostrils hung motionless in the still air, like smoke from a chimney. Standing there with nothing to do, beneath the blank white quiet the storm had left behind, Pierce felt something unfamiliar for the first time in months. Cold remained, but it was no longer pursuing him. Pierce turned back toward the hollow under the basalt ridge, where the shelter had nearly vanished from sight. Snow had covered the wagon bed almost to the top edge. The oil tarp had frozen stiff against the drift, looking less like canvas and more like another layer of pale stone. It was fused to the mountainside itself, every seam hidden under packed snow. From a distance, no traveler would have recognized it as man-made. It looked like part of the ridge, a dark wound in the basalt, half swallowed by winter. Pierce came closer and put one gloved hand on the frozen wagon board. The wood felt solid beneath the ice, and Eli Mercer came to mind. Laughing by the freight yard in Garnet Basin, calling the wagon nothing but firewood waiting to collapse, then he remembered Clara. She had sat on that same wagon seat in the final autumn before her illness worsened, wrapped in a wool blanket against the evening chill, while Brim pulled them slowly through falling leaves. Outside town now, that same wrecked wagon stood buried under snow after surviving a blizzard fierce enough to kill men. Across the ridge, the cracked boards had held, and the broken thing had become the line between life and death. For a long while, Pierce remained silent, not uttering a word. He then withdrew his hand from the ice-covered timber, grabbed Brim's reins, and headed southward into the hushed whiteness. Reaching the Valley Ranch, which lay to the south of the Bitterroots, required 4 additional days for Pierce. Behind him, the landscape had been transformed by the storm, and scattered along the route were deserted freight sleds, partially submerged in snowbanks. A lone horse, frozen solid, was standing next to a split-rail fence buried in snow, its mane stiff with ice. Its head hung low, as though it were still trying to find earth beneath the drifts. On 2 occasions, Pierce encountered the trails left by recovery teams carrying corpses from the upper ridges down to the lower communities. The storm had claimed the lives of freight haulers on every mountain pass. Word spread more quickly than the living, and when Pierce finally arrived at his cousin's ranch at twilight, the entire valley was already aware. They knew exactly how many wagon teams had not made it over the passes. His jacket was rigid with ice and snow, and frost reached nearly to his collar across his beard. Brim appeared gaunter than at their departure. The horse, Garnet Basin, showed ribs barely showing through its thick winter hair. As soon as he spotted them, Pierce's cousin emerged from the barn and halted mid-step. He wasn't merely taken aback. He was utterly shocked, like someone witnessing a person claw their way out of a grave they had already mentally sealed. Once inside the ranch house, where the warmth of the stove crackled gently through the iron joints, Pierce detailed the shelter step by step. The story involved a hollow in the basalt, the side of a wagon, tightly packed gaps, and an unmoving pocket of air caught underneath the piled snow. His cousin heard him out in silence until he had finished the account. After that, he eased back in his chair and posed the single, truly important question: what makes you certain it would endure? For an instant, Pierce recalled Amos Varn years ago under the freight bridge, with smoke from a lantern drifting through the broken slats into the cold darkness. His gaze shifted to the harness by the stove's entrance, where frost was still thawing from Brim's gear, and he replied in a low voice. It didn't have to be sturdy. He hesitated briefly, then added, it just had to shut tight. At that instant, his cousin grasped a truth that few people ever learned concerning mountain storms. Pierce hadn't conquered the blizzard. He'd simply created a spot that the wind couldn't reach. In the years that followed, the Southern Valley residents continued to murmur about the cargo driver who managed to live through the Bitterroot storm. His method was dragging a damaged wagon into a rocky indentation and burying himself under the snow. No newspaper ever covered the tale, no railway company put it on record, and no county clerk took the trouble to write down the specifics. Like much frontier wisdom back then, it endured through word of mouth rather than written text. Traders at posts shared the tale over coffee cans as they thawed their chilled fingers. Ranchers' wives brought it up following church meals whenever severe winters struck the hills again. Wagoneers on the Bitterroot routes advised younger haulers to keep an eye on the wind near basalt cliffs and keep in mind the fellow who made it through. What saved him was his knowledge that tight joints mattered more than thick barriers. Over the years, various renditions circulated. A few said Pierce used heavy mining tarpaulin as thick as buffalo leather. Others insisted that trappers had used the cave decades before. There were even those who claimed the snow completely entombed him for 3 days, until he dug his way out alive. All versions, however, preserved the same final outcome. The snowstorm destroyed tougher individuals who had superior carts, because they attempted to battle the elements out in the open. Pierce Halbrook lived because he located a calm spot beyond the reach of the wind. Throughout the mountain region, that insight endured far beyond the man's own lifetime. Pierce Halbrook's tale was never truly concerned with a cart, a chunk of basalt, or even enduring a Bitterroot winter. It was about what is left when a person's life has already begun to disintegrate. A wheel axle broke from excessive load, and the weather ripped a canvas covering away from its ties. Sitting by a sickbed that no treatment could help, life savings dwindled with each payment that came due. The majority of frontier men were familiar with damaged objects. Their true fear was the moment when numerous damaged parts all gave way simultaneously. When the storm came, Pierce grasped a notion far simpler than power. He didn't squander time longing for superior wood, denser walls, or an altogether different existence. He drew what was left together and closed off each crack one after another. Within that crude refuge below the basalt ridge, he fashioned a pocket of calm, wide enough to preserve his life until dawn. It was nothing more than that. The blizzard didn't concern itself with the beauty of the walls, nor did it care whether the cart had once had any monetary value. It didn't matter to the mountain whether the tarp was already falling apart before the storm hit. Its sole concern was this: could the wind slip inside? And that night, underneath the snow-covered ridge, the wind couldn't. So the blizzard never truly reached him. Not all survivors beat winter. Some men just managed to put up 4 walls solid enough that the storm swept around them rather than blowing straight through.